All right. Welcome to the Bright Talk on securing multi-cloud environments, why do-it-yourself privileged access management doesn't work. We're going to give everyone a little bit of time to join. Welcome. I wonder if at this point, it'd be nice if Bright Talk allowed me to do a poll to see if you have joined. All right. Give everyone another 30 seconds roughly. All righty. This will be available, as pointed out. It's a recorded presentation, so live folks, feel free to take in the data, and anyone else watching after the thought. Thank you for joining Britive and Focal Point CDW for our presentation on securing multi-cloud environments and why do-it-yourself privileged access management doesn't work. Just to level set with the agenda, we're going to make some quick introductions of some folks joining us, including Ian Cummings and Chase Cunningham, and they're going to discuss from their perspective and experience this specific problem of do-it-yourself, including use cases and where zero trust fits. We're going to wrap that up with a demo of Britive's solution in addressing this particular problem as it relates, to the cloud, and we'll open it up for questions. Speakers today include some very notable and great folks. Dr. Chase Cunningham, Chief Strategy Officer at Aircom. Chase, also known as Dr. Zero Trust, has been a guest in discussing zero trust initiatives with Britive View 4 and really encompassing, extending that framework. Joining us as well is Ian Cumming. I am Executive Advisor for Focal Point. Ian's got vast experience in helping mid-size and enterprise leaders really turn IAM from a point-in-time solution to a real strategy, right? And helping enterprises really get through all the ins and outs of identity as a thought leader. And I'll be your MC, John Morton, Director of Solutions Engineering for Britive. I've done anything you can think of on both the defender side and the vendor side, and I'll be presenting for you all today. So what are we here to talk about? What problem are we trying to solve, and how do we solve it, right? Fundamental questions any CISO should ask, anybody should ask, really. Securing multi-cloud environments and why do-it-yourself privileged access management doesn't work. We're not saying that there's not a lot of smart people out there that can't make it work. We're just saying there are trials and tribulations that associate with this that make it difficult, right? Organizations using multi-cloud environments, they realize some of the advantages of the cloud is not just the lift and shift of servers, but it also includes using cloud services and new capabilities like just in time, right? And by new, it's just polishing up an old great idea and making it better, like the idea of least privilege and this concept of zero standing privileges. But getting there is not as easy as it sounds, right? A lot of tools that exist today were built for on-premise. A lot of objectives are time-consuming, complex, and nearly impossible to enforce. So without a unified model, really an abstraction layer to address humans and non-humans across cloud, right? Almost no one lives in a single silo anymore of AWS or GCP or Azure. There's not a lot of options that leaders have, and that's what we want to help with today. So as a result, users are granted elevated privileges they don't need, which increase risk and really expands the attack surface. Key takeaway there, not just humans anymore, also service identities. So a couple of the key concepts everyone should walk away with after this Bright Talk, if I did a pop quiz, which would be cruel, are what is just in time, right? It's that granting of accounts, not just privileged accounts, any account, human and non-human, appropriate privileges on a time-limited basis. I give you something and I take it away. This relates to that just enough privilege grants, where accounts should receive the exact permissions required to do only the target systems authorized. Apologies there. And ultimately, getting to a state of zero standing privileges where we're saying, let's combine just in time with just enough to remove these always on standing privileges that we see assigned to humans, we see assigned to tokens, and let's really get to this new concept of leveraging the cloud appropriately. Ian, go ahead.
Thanks. So we'll start with the obligatory stats here. It's easy to say that these numbers are meaningful, but you have to think about them in a different context. Even though the organizations admitted that 74% of the breaches were due to stolen credentials or involved a privileged account, 100% of the breaches involved an account of some type that had legitimate access that was used in an inappropriate way. And that doesn't say that the breach was necessarily malicious in nature, but what it does say is that, once again, I qualify for free credit monitoring. And you also have to look at this in context of, this is the organizations admitting. How many organizations out there didn't admit this? Is it a problem? Yes, it absolutely is. You look at 29% of the breaches involved using stolen credentials, and that's great on its own, enough for us to get excited about, we have to fix this. But phishing has to be taken into account as well, because if you go into a store and stick something in a bag yourself, well, yeah, that's stealing, but it's still stealing if you have a willing accomplice, or maybe even an unwilling accomplice that's tricked into helping you and sticking a good inside your bag. So the bottom line here is that when we look at these statistics, that the commonality that you have to address here is that there was access, and access, either appropriate or inappropriate, resulted in a loss, and we have to be able to mitigate that. We look at what's the root cause of this, and commonality across most organizations is that overprivileging is the real problem. We have practices that have been in place for a long time, and business as usual is the way that we just tend to go on things. We don't look at how least privilege can help us here. We, in fact, end up violating the tenets of least privilege by just going along with what we've always done, before we started to really have this focus on how do we get to just the right amount of privilege to get the job done. Business as usual leads us to having these fully armed accounts. And what that means is that we've become accustomed, as we interact with applications, to having accounts that have a lot of privilege that allow us to get the job done, but there's never that audit look at it that says, is this exactly what I need to get the job done, or is it far beyond what I need to get the job done? And usually we default to convenience to determine what that is. And while everybody will scream and create a fuss when they don't have the proper access to get their job done, when they have too much, people are usually silent, because it allows them to do their business as usual. What it ends up doing is creating a larger attack vector for people to use to exfiltrate data, plant malware, do any number of things to compromise the enterprise. The response to this has been, we'll traditionally go to vaulting. We'll look at session recording so that we can see what's going on. The problem becomes that becomes a much more reactionary posture. So you end up knowing what happened, but it's too late to stop it from happening. Vaulting will take care of part of the problem, but you have to look at what the entirety of your exposure is in order to deal with it effectively. And that means that it's not just privileged accounts, it's accounts that have valid access that have the potential to be misused. So we have to look at the bigger picture when it comes to privilege to include all users, not just those that we've traditionally thought of as high privilege users. There's, as I mentioned before, an organizational pushback when it comes to right sizing the amount of privilege that the accounts have. People get used to having their own administrative account or interacting with systems in a specific way. And that gets them into a comfort zone that is not necessarily the best place to be for managing privilege. So what we have to do is take a really close look at this and say, you know what, usability will not suffer. Changing the way that you do things absolutely isn't going to be a horrible thing, because every single user in the organization has to be aligned to increasing the security posture, to being behind the business in keeping the business running. Because if you get ransomware in there, if you have data losses, the business ceases to run as it used to. You end up losing confidence in the brand, losing clients, or worse yet, going out of business entirely. So we have to look beyond where we typically have, and we have to really look at what the definition of privilege should be and how we're going to manage that. So the response now has to be elevated. We can't just look at privileged access in a vacuum and say vaulting and session recording is enough. We have to look at the concepts of zero standing privilege and just-in-time privilege to allow us to keep the business running the way it needs to be running. And we have to reduce that attack vector, because every single day you hear about new breaches, new attacks that are coming, and a never-ending stream of patches is not going to be enough to protect yourself from the use of accounts that are legitimate and have legitimate access. So by reducing the standing privilege, by allowing that privilege to be elevated on a just-in-time basis, it allows you to increase your security posture. And this has really taken hold, and to the point where Gartner has said that we're going to have 30% growth in the adoption of these technologies moving forward. So why we need just-in-time? Many of the credentials we use on a day-to-day basis within applications, within infrastructure, are always on, and they have high levels of access. And that in and of itself creates an attack vector that is very tempting. So we have to be able to reduce that attack vector and move forward with less privileged accounts and be able to turn these accounts off and on as we need it, or allow that privilege to exist for a specified period of time and then go away. Administrative access to production systems doesn't really need to happen unless there's an outage or during pre-scheduled change windows, because you don't want to interrupt the business. So why should there be standing privilege when you're not actually going to be using those accounts? Inherited permissions become a problem because as we go through and upgrade and migrate and move users around the organization, permissions get inherited and obfuscated, so we don't really know what privilege any user holds at a given point in time, because it's nested so far down, or it's obfuscated through this myriad of groups that we've created. And can be inherited by literally hundreds of users that don't need to have that privilege. So we need a clear way of expressing that privilege and presenting that so that we can fully understand what privilege exists, who has it, and who needs it. And you look at the privileged account management tools that exist today, and most of them were not built to deal with this new way of thinking, this proliferation of privilege that's come by, the cloud vendors who have each their own platform and each their own way of expressing privilege. So we look at, just in time, and like anything, you don't want to look at that in a vacuum. You have to look at the broader use cases. So you look at on-demand access to control panels like in AWS, because inheritance is a problem, and a problem in those environments just like others, but it's dealing with these users that have on-demand access. So zero standing privilege comes in and is used to make sure that only when nobody's using it, that privilege isn't sitting out there waiting for somebody to misuse it. You look at time limiting the access to these privileged accounts, and it doesn't have to be privilege in the traditional sense. It can be privilege as in users who have legitimate access to sensitive information as well, that when they're not using that access, that it doesn't have to be there for others to misuse or to be subject to an external attack. You look at escalation and delegation, right? You don't have the ability to adequately control inherited privileges through nestigers, even when they're elevated. So we have to right size our access to make sure that as we do this, that we're thinking holistically. We can't be looking at any one element as the silver bullet that's going to ultimately fix it. We have to change the way we think. And you look at some approaches where privileged accounts are created and deleted, and as that is done by some solutions. And what that does is it just makes it extremely difficult for tracing activity, for compliance, for audit in the cases where something may have gone wrong. So, we don't always look at these as malicious acts. We have to look at what happens if a change is made by one of these accounts that was created and then deleted, and we don't know who was using it at that time, and something went wrong, and you want to be able to go in and reverse it. We also run that same thing with ephemeral tokens. Right now, we've got tokens that are sitting out there in applications that may be hard coded, and I hope not. They may be static tokens taken through scripts or APIs, but we have this PKI infrastructure that now we have to manage to make that effective. So we have to be able to do these things in a thoughtful way so that privilege is there, auditable, able to be used, and then it disappears. We need to be able to dynamically change the privilege from AD groups, especially here where a lot of times as organizations migrate to newer versions and upgrade and change and acquire and divest, that we have a situation where privilege can be accumulated and obfuscated so that nobody really knows what's going on, because their audit tool can only go one level deep or two levels deep in inheritance. And we've got now, because of acquired entities and changes we made over the time, we've got 8 levels of nesting of these groups, and it just makes it entirely too difficult to manage and takes away any sort of visibility we had into what's going on in the environment. So how do we get there, right? Achieving this is not easy without the right set of tools and the right set of capabilities. You have to measure your standing privileges, audit the accounts that you have with standing privilege across all of your platforms, workstations, servers, systems, cloud environments, you name it, right? And this introduces some difficulty in that you have platforms that have different ways of describing the same level of privilege. So you have to be able to aggregate all of this information and make sense of it. We have to right size the permission sets that we have today. We have to remove the excesses that we have, stop the rogue creation of administrative accounts, and stop the continued use of personalized administrative accounts. Move to a more right-sized set of permissions so that users have the ability to do what they need to do in that task, and then that's taken away when the task is complete and they no longer have the need for the use of that privilege. And then we have to be able to move privileged accounts to a just-in-time model, right? So taking away that standing privilege, allowing just-in-time escalation, allowing those permissions to exist on the account and then be removed at an appropriate time, so that we only have those permissions in place that are necessary and not providing an attack vector for somebody to use. So doing it yourself is another approach that is along the lines of business as usual, right? We are moving to the cloud at an accelerated rate. We have solutions in place that we can lift and shift and move into the cloud with all of our workloads. And we run into the problem that in a modern cloud environment where the tooling that we have in place isn't appropriate for what we are wanting to do or needing to do is not giving us a false sense of security. So what we have to do is look at those legacy tools, take the appropriate function out of them that can be leveraged and still is valid, and pair them with the solutions that allow us to get to that zero standing privilege and just in time. We look at homegrown solutions that get put in place, and the tendency in this rush to the cloud for lines of business to make these changes without getting security involved. What that does is it creates an impossible environment for security to do their job. And what we have to do now is get security back into the fold, start to get their input onto this, and get the experts on those cloud platforms and in cloud security to get the right tooling in place to augment what we've got from a legacy perspective. We need to look at the security tool set that we have. Does it meet the needs that we have? Homegrown solutions typically were built to allow for a very limited set of use cases. But what ends up happening is that those set of use cases don't take into account the security needs of the cloud platform that we may be on. They don't take the least privilege and just-in-time privilege escalation into account, so that we end up Now, in the same problem that we had in the on-premise world, where we've had to hard code credentials and secrets into the application itself. And it just creates vulnerabilities that we don't need to be there. And it adds to the cost to support the solution. So how Focal Point can help. We have rapid assessments that we can do that can help enumerate the privilege that you have there. Look at what your roadmap looks like for moving from your current state to a more zero trust enabled environment. Take you down the road to build zero standing privilege, just in time provisioning. We can build you that holistic roadmap that takes this into account with the entirety of your identity and access management program. And you can make thoughtful decisions along the way to address these issues with complementary solutions that take into account what you've already invested in. We can help from technology deployment standpoint, which is self-explanatory. Once we build that plan, we can help you execute on it. And once we've executed on it, we can take on the ongoing management with you to augment your organization with access to subject matter experts in this space, all the way down to a managed support offerings that can do troubleshooting and operational support for you, so that you can take your organization to that end state faster by being able to leverage expertise that's already there that you may not have been able to build into the organization. And with that, I will pass the mic, so to speak.
Not sure. There you are, Chase.
Yeah, so sorry, it was just a lag there. So this is super interesting for me, because we've got kind of two sides of the coin, where we've got a service provider and then we have a technology provider that are talking about the same thing. So this is very good. Zero trust for the identity defined perimeter, right? The identity defined perimeter means restricting access to cloud applications and data based on policies, controlling privilege sets and the duration, especially for privileged users. The one thing that you don't want, and there's lots and lots of proof out there that this is a big problem, is administrators and overprivileged users doing things in your infrastructure. If you're going to solve any problem like now, today, solve that today. The way that you do that is with a really well put together policy engine. It's not possible to do this with spreadsheets, and we'll talk about that. So I conducted a study that got about 1,300 responses. It took about 2 months to get all the data back and crunch through it, and kind of came out with what were the real ground truth things within zero trust. Because I sit around kind of in the ZT world and I do lots of research and analysis on different things from different vendors, lots of stuff from different people that talk about ZT. And I wanted to ask the market, without any spin, without any partisanship, like, who did real ZT? And how does ZT look? Like, what do you do? So this was one of the most critical questions that I think that I asked, was to enable zero trust, a company's infrastructure must first address. And I specifically crafted these questions. I learned this working at Forrester to get the real responses I was looking for. And the key word here is first, right? And I would have thought that this would have been a lot more endpoint, or a lot more firewall, or a lot more network. But the market, the people that are doing the work, that are out there actually engaged in zero trust, said identity and access management by a factor of 2x over anything else. So when we look at what people need when they want to solve this problem, and what they think from the folks that are actually engaged in enabling the strategy, what do they solve for first? Identity and access management. If you don't have really good IAM, and you don't take care of users, and you don't have all these things solved that we've talked about, you won't get to ZT. You can have the best firewall in the universe. User with an admin privilege gets through, game over. You can have the best endpoint security out there. Somebody has excessive privileges and does stuff inside the infrastructure, game over. Now, the other thing that I would take away from this is that cloud security was up there ahead of endpoint. So that means cloud is as important, if not slightly more important than endpoint. And what is really important within cloud? IAM. The most difficult part of Zero Trust to manage technically, and that's the key word, is technically, right? Not most difficult, but manage technically is what? It's policies. It's not the cloud migration, which I thought personally cloud was going to be the big problem. Everybody was going to say it's really hard to get to cloud, to use cloud effectively. It's just too difficult. That was honestly one of the lowest ones on here. I also thought that it was going to be really difficult when they talk about frequent change in the environment. But the real issue, the most difficult thing to technically manage is policies. Well, what does policies touch? Policies touches everything within infrastructure. Policies, if done correctly, manage change, manage hybrid cloud systems, manage users, manage cloud migration, all that stuff. So if you don't have really good IAM and you don't have really good policy management and you can't do things across infrastructure at speed and scale, you will not be able to enable Zero Trust. So saith about 1,300 people that are out there actually doing the work. My biggest technical hindrance, and this is asking the folks that are there personally, like, what is your biggest problem for Zero Trust is what? It's legacy technology. Now, this one for me actually threw me for a pretty big loop because I thought it was going to be shadow IT, BYOD. And then I had a lot of folks that say it's going to be about scalability. It wasn't. It was about legacy technology. And I had to kind of step back from that for a minute and think, well, why would that be the biggest problem for folks to get to the next step in ZT? If you think about it, legacy tech is what's mostly churning the bits to do the work to generate revenue for companies. Everyone has their hands around that warm, fuzzy thing, that server or whatever else that's doing stuff to generate money and make everyone, happier in the business context. And that legacy stuff is hard to move off of. The other piece is that legacy technology has already been configured and is kind of sitting there doing its thing. It's the big diesel engine driving the ship. No one wants to mess with that. Why? Because if you change permissions, if you move stuff around, it will fall over. And when legacy tech falls over, people freak out because you're not generating revenue. So what that means, going back to the other ones, and this just continues to kind of feed on itself, you have to have really good IAM programs and policies and capability in place to solve those problems. You have to have policy engines that will reach legacy tech and take care of cloud, hybrid, et cetera. And you have to have a focus on figuring out how to move off of legacy technology, but do so smartly, do so intelligently, and do so with technology that's going to aid you into the cloud era more effectively. If you don't do those things, you won't actually solve for ZT. And again, this is not the vendor spin. This is not somebody that just is validating their own sort of hypotheses. This is 1,283 people doing the work, saying that these are the things that are in their way. John, I think we're over to you now.
I do believe so. Thank you, Chase and Ian. One of the things that keeps recurring, right, is to both points, as presented now, is what are people doing? What options do they have? How do I solve this problem, right? And what we see a lot of times at Britive is there are many creative people that are very smart that are trying to address these issues of saying, well, we see value in the cloud. We want to move to the cloud. We want to move fast. How do we do it? And it always starts a couple ways. It's a consistent theme when we talk to builders. I'm going to focus a lot on this term called builders, which I classify as platform operations, cloud architect, DevOps, DevSecOps. Even within their own ecosystem, they don't have a standardized method of labeling themselves, but these are the folks who are really driving this transformation and push to the cloud. And they always come to the same conclusions of, well, the cloud is no longer just the lift and shift of servers. There are cloud services we want to leverage to get our most bang for the buck. Let's try an open source vault. And everyone loves it, and we do too at Britive, right? We started this same experience of vaults and managing credentials work. On-premise solutions do a terrible job of satisfying the needs of the cloud, but there are some solutions that exist that help us, and they're open source. The problem is you start to build a production ecosystem around an open source tool, lots of scary things can happen. And, there's no standard way of managing even a simple request like, hey, can I get some help with this particular tool? They're going to ask you for money. Forget the whole open source idea. The other thing we see happen is a lot of customers, they evolve and they say, well, these cloud native solutions, they have their own IAM concept. I think Ian nailed it, right? They have their own vernacular about what they call resources, objects, and entities, and they have their own methods of managing permissions. Some are deny all, allow specific. Some are open to the world, do anything you want, right? And they start to realize each of these silos of cloud services, from GCP to Oracle to Azure to AWS, they all have their own IAM, and they think, well, let's just build it, right? Let's build in there and use those. What happens though here with this problem is there's silos. You need to find experts now, not just in cloud, but also in security, also in identity, also specific to that cloud service. So from a monetary cost, that's almost impossible. That's like I don't know what the next step from a unicorn is, but you're trying to do this natively across each CSP. The other option that we see ultimately is they build their own. They say, okay, we have this idea of a vault. We have this idea that there are IAM capabilities within each cloud service. What if we build our own abstraction layer to make this work? Great idea. We absolutely have faith the builders are smart enough to do it, but most organizations, to Chase's point, their objective normally is to make money in doing other things, not building security tools that require constant care and feeding of APIs, agents, jump servers, and really new ways to do it. So this is what we see as that problem statement now, where these folks are trying to use the tools, that are built for the cloud because they see things on premise just don't work, right? So to kind of sum it up, here's that realistic expectation of Vault. You don't really have a support. Someone builds something, no tribal knowledge. IAM native, great idea. But man, the expertise in that costs, and it's truly siloed. And then build your own. Again, what happens when that guy gets hit by the lottery bus or lady and they leave and they built everything for you and you don't know what's happening, right? So the cost there is very expensive. So what Britive really tries to do is bring together, hey, how do we get these benefits that make sense to our customers, where we're kind of, when you go to that build versus buy conversation, how does it make sense to apply Britive? Right? Total cost of ownership and time to value. We don't have things like agents, jump servers, proxies. We become an abstraction layer. This is my favorite visualization ever. Imagine a monkey that lives in the cloud and it pulls levers of authorization across each. That's Britive, right? In a nutshell, we want to reduce that risk threat landscape by embracing this concept of zero standing permissions, right? This requires a re-engineering of how you think about the cloud. The architecture is not the same as on-premise. How do we easily gain and revoke access for our users? Cloud ops, security admins. How do we make this all auditable, right? We need this single pane of glass, this collection of, accounts, groups, and privileges. And then we need to achieve that zero trust idea by embracing this concept of zero standing permissions, right? Not only do we not trust you to have an account, we don't trust your account to have privileges. We will give it to it just in time when it needs it, right? So there's a process that goes around that. Just to highlight where we fit in the ecosystem as well, we know there are tons of tools out there, to Chase's point and to Ian's point. There's already been huge investments in other solutions that help try to solve this problem. The problem is where are they really getting that just-in-time capabilities to the cloud itself? That's where Britive sits. Authorization is what we care about. We don't want to get into the business of authentication, although we can. Let's let Okta do that, Ping do that, Azure do that. You spent a lot of money into those solutions for single sign-on and things like RBAC. What about user requests, access certifications? Same story, right? Just different side of the coin. Governance, audit, compliance. They love SailPoint. Great, so do we. Let's integrate. Savient, Workday, ServiceNow, Jira. At the same token, we want to be able to export now all this very identity-centric security information to your SIM. Why have people been ignoring identity data for so long? Because it's too expensive. And no one ever understood, to Ian's point, nested groups, nested access. What is a token and why does it have all this privilege? We want to be able to feed that sort of pertinent content downstream to other solutions, all while still addressing this concept of let's scan your cloud and give you just in time. Okay. So for the next part, I'm going to end the slideshow and I'm actually just going to share my screen here. And I'm going to walk through what do we mean by just in time? What do we mean by abstraction layer? What do we mean by do it yourself is complicated or it can be complicated, right? So Britive is a SaaS solution. It lives in the cloud. I give you a tenant, you name it what you want. We have access to all of the cloud services. Again, the orchestration monkey is right here. These are the things you have access to as a person. In this case, I'm a human. There is tokenized access as well. I'll highlight that in a second, but What's very important, where I think a lot of other solutions fail, not just in addressing process by integrating in the ecosystem, is making the user experience front and center. If people are not going to use your tool, right, why buy it? So what we're looking at is Britive's My Access page, where I have access to different cloud services. Very interesting note here. It is not limited to Azure, GCP, Oracle, and AWS. Some people may be shocked even Oracle's on here. Britive has this idea that the cloud is the cloud. Anything that has APIs, anything that has accounts, groups, and permissions, and some sort of audit logging can be integrated into our tool. We have a few of these GA right here. So what does that mean, right? When people want to access AWS, for example, our idea is, why are you still assigning static user accounts within AWS that have static access? This is not scalable. This is not repeatable. There's a lot of effort in doing this. So what we've noticed in the builder community is AWS is a particularly cool tool. We are huge fans. What they have the ability to do is actually do away with user accounts altogether. You can do something called role assumption. This is what I mean when I talk about on-premise and cloud being drastically different, and there needing to be a re-education of folks about why it matters. So the builders, those folks who are do-it-yourselfers, they see this capability and they say, awesome. With the ability to assume a role, we can now create ephemeral connections that exist on demand. So what do? If I have to go and make a workflow request approval that goes through 8 people that finally gets approved 3 weeks later after I needed the access, they figured out new methods to do things like role assumption. This isn't a bad thing. We want to embrace this, but teach them to move fast. So in this case, I have access to 3 AWS environments. In AWS, they're called accounts. Again, vernacular, very strange, right? People in identity, they hear the word account, they think, oh, I can log in. No, AWS accounts are environments. So I have 3 of them. I have access to a role. Again, we can bring this together with some sort of concept that's traditional to security and IAM like RBAC. Maybe you are in a certain group in Active Directory in Azure, or in a certain group in Okta, or maybe by your title, S3 developer, you should have access to these permissions. Britive wants to automate that. We want to make that easy. The goal is our end users don't really care. Our builders will build what they want in this environment. We're trying to embrace this notion of them doing it. So when they come here and they say, cool, I have S3 developer access, we have a checkout button. This means I'm going to create that temporary session, meaning I'm exposing to you the session and the secrets associated with this just-in-time access to Sigma Labs as an S3 developer, which correlates to the S3 full access role, right? And you can do your job. I click on console. It's going to take me straight into S3, straight into that AWS account, straight into the landing page I need because I have federated access coming from Britive. It seems very simple, but this is very trivial to a lot of folks, right? What else does this do? This allows us to have programmatic access. This is where the future is going. This is where builders want to be. I want to automate all of what I just did interactively via console. So we're exposing secrets that temporarily exist. What that does is it allows Britive to now do things via command line. You saw on our list, Okta, a bunch of other folks say they're doing just-in-time, but this is what we mean by just-in-time. When you need to do some function, Britive checkout. Britive is going to ask you, you want to use our CLI? Who are you? We're forcing folks to embrace the rest of the ecosystem. In this case, I authenticate through Okta. Cool. Britive says you have authenticated through Okta. You can now use your CLI. You programmatically have access to these very different cloud environments, cloud service providers, AWS, Azure, and GCP. Awesome. I want to do a task in AWS. Programmatically, I have access to these AWS accounts. Programmatically, I have access to this role. I would like to assume this role. What would you like to do with these credentials that are these secrets that I'm presenting to you? You know, Mr. and Mrs. Customer, just give them to me in JSON because I'm going to embed these into a Python script. So what folks want to do is they're proactively trying to get to this state of automation where they make using access, general cloud access, this ephemeral connection I just created on the fly in an automated fashion. The beauty of this is it works the same way across cloud. This is where do-it-yourself kind of struggles for most of our customers. They can normally get AWS down pretty well. Then they try to branch out to Azure. Now, Azure has a different approach. Azure is a more of deny all, allow specific. Azure even states in most cases, you have to have a user account, but that doesn't mean you have to have permissions. Zero standing permissions means you don't have those. So you can check out access when you need it, in this case on the RBAC side of Azure, to dev environment resource as the admin. That's the role. So Britive is just in this point standardizing how we allow folks to access the world, even in a programmatic fashion. We embrace the organization that do this well, and we love those types of builders. HashiCorp's Terraform, we have a Terraform provider, meaning step one, you kick off a Jenkins job, it builds a resource, you tell Ansible to do something, and then you tell Terraform, hey Terraform, I just built this resource in AWS, Azure, GCP, whatever. Can you build in temporary access using Britive? Yes, cool. Go ahead and build that in. So when you see here, of course I get an error during a demo, when we do a Britive checkout of different resources, you can see that we're standardizing how they can kind of just check out temporary credentials. Even in the case of GCP, radically different environment, right? Again, Britive is going out, orchestration monkey, saying authorization is approved. Here are your temporary credentials to now check out your access in GCP, right? So why is everyone pretty happy? Why does this matter? For security teams, now we're saying, we have given you temporary access to these environments. They exist for this long. If we didn't give people this access and we didn't take it away, they would keep it forever. And that's that overprivileged concept. So again, getting back to this concept of zero standing permissions and least privilege is exactly what we're trying to go to this automated fashion, leveraging the capabilities of the cloud while providing that visibility that we kind of highlighted, over the course of this conversation. Ian brought up a very good point about when we talk about, what's happening in AWS. I just checked out access from Sigma, this environment called Sigma Dev. Can we see what's happening? This sort of visibility is absolutely pertinent to what we're doing as well. And if you keep in mind, we're not just talking about user accounts. We're talking about groups. We're talking about roles. We're talking about service principals. This is another abstraction layer for security teams and identity teams to wrap their mind around is, I can give permissions to an entity, a service principal, a Lambda function that runs in Kubernetes. But what Britive is doing is we're saying we want to analyze how it's being used. How is this service principal leveraging its effective permissions? This is radically different than a user idea, right? This is a function that lives within AWS that these builders can build. They give it default policies, right? EKS cluster, and they give it this ability to assume role. We can have a whole nother talk track about that. Trust me, it's very powerful. But what Britive is saying is over the past 90 days, we've only seen it ever do two things, right? It only really looks at EC2. So helping customers visualize and analyze effective permissions across the cloud is something we're very concerned about, especially when it comes to security. In the case of this EKS Kubernetes cluster, it has access to key management system, of which it doesn't do anything, and it has access to a ton of resources. Britive is trying to say, if you'd like to get to JIT, you should probably clean up this particular environment, right? So just to bring it back home, our whole goal is that idea of, least zero standing privileges where we can, ephemeral connections where we need to. And although do-it-yourself seems appealing, Britive has done this and we've productized it. And we're very proud to work with partners like Focal Point and thought leaders, right, like Chase, in understanding how do we improve what we're doing? How do we take all these great ideas and really apply them to the world? All right, that was a very quick demo. I know it only took about 5 minutes, but I think it gets the point across. Oops, let me stop screen sharing here. And there's our panel of presenters. I think right now we have about 10 minutes left. I don't want to waste everyone's time. We can open it up for questions if anyone has any questions. All right, let's see here. Let's give it about a minute. Chase, Ian, any forethought while we're waiting on questions?
I mean, just from the market perspective, and I really am a fan of this approach because there's this thing we always talk about like developers are kind of the redheaded stepchildren of security, right? We just say, oh, those dang devs, they're doing devy stuff, and they cause security problems. That shouldn't be an issue, and I think we've seen a shift in the market where it's really around look, do your job. Security will be made available sort of to you. Like, I'll put you in the car and buckle the seatbelt and turn the airbag on. All you got to do is drive. And that's where we start to really gain ground here. Instead of the old days where we blame people for security failures, now we can actually enable them to do their job, and security happens whether they like it or not.
Love it. Ian?
Yeah, and I've had my identity stolen enough times that you know, the dev's doing devy things. I like that. I'm totally stealing it. I mean, there are holes in the way that we've done things traditionally, right? We need to take a more thoughtful approach. We need to take a more planned approach to building out our identity infrastructure and programs. And we need to allow the business to do the things the business needs to do, but we have to mitigate that with just stopping the business as usual way of doing things and taking that more metered approach to handing out privilege, to answering, do you really need it now? And we need to be able to plug those holes in the traditional way of doing things.
Yeah. Yeah, the cloud moves so fast. I don't remember who said that. I think both of you, but it is surprising what we don't know, right? So one of the questions that just came in about that is specifically around discovery of existing permissions, right? And Britive obviously can do that using our advanced data analytics tool. We're built on Snowflake. We just made a big announcement today. But one of the things we like to help customers with too is they love this idea of just in time. I would say that no one disagrees with us right now. The problem is that vision. How do I get there? And they always default to, well, maybe if I had visibility, I can get there. I think that was to your point too, Ian, where, you know, Focal Point can help. We absolutely agree, right? So we look at it as two ways. Can we ingest historical data, 90 days worth, and analyze those effective permissions? Yes, I kind of highlighted that. And then two, going forward, can we further refine and proactively monitor? So it goes back to the process of, you know, visibility is great. I love being a defender, and we would deliver a report to a business unit and they'd be like, what am I supposed to do with this? You're telling me what was for breakfast earlier this week and today it's Friday. And I'm like, well, I think I need you to sign it for audit and compliance. So, you know, enabling folks is an interesting situation, right? And we want to fit the process, but also keep up to speed with devs doing devy things.
That's going to be around forever now.
One other quick question specific to Britive was, you know, does Britive support Kubernetes? And, you know, we get this question a lot too. And Kubernetes is a hot thing today. So yes, you know, you saw my example with EKS. But what's going to happen tomorrow? This is what's magic about the cloud is these services, they're occurring every day. So by the time we, you know, try to build a framework around it, I don't know for sure if it'll still be there, but that's part of the advantage. We see every day these attacks of Azure Cosmos DB. That was most recently in the news, right? We see S3 buckets in AWS publicly exposed. So I think it's going to take a lot of that combination of how do we understand what we're trying to do? One, to make money, and then two, from a securities perspective, and then three, come together to really combine that. Because when we see folks consistently doing it yourself, that says to me over and over again, no one's solving the problem, right? And it is a recurring theme we keep seeing with these builders that are cloud forward, where they're doing it themselves because no one's helping them solve the problem. First and foremost, you know, quick plug for Britive, we are. Chase, Ian.
I think that one thing is that you have to acknowledge the problem, and that's usually not done until it's far too late.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think too, like I like to look at solutions from the perspective of if I'm just a regular security person that does security things, is can I use it in the context of someone that's not me? And the thing that I like about the approach here is, I'm a terrible programmer. I'll openly admit that. If I'm writing code, the world has it's probably burst into flame. Like it's a really bad day. However, I could use this system and capabilities that are there and do CLI stuff and not have it be miserable. So I think that there's a value that we kind of miss in this space when security, like you said, security folks, we're in our bucket and we always look at things in the security bucket. However, a good solution makes it where we can see things from other people's perspective. I guess you could call it, if I'm going to coin another term here, empathetic security, right? I should be able to empathize with those people and see things from their perspective, which admittedly we're not usually very good at.
Well, to that note, moving out of the business as usual mindset, that piece of helping the developers do devy things that you showed will actually speed their time to value. It'll help them move things along at a greater pace, and it'll help them do it in a secure way. And that's where exactly you have to look at these transformative approaches and get out of we've always done it this way, so we have to keep doing it this way. Because once you embrace this way of doing things, you'll find it's faster, it's more secure, and it's better for the business.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. We can end this, Ian and Chase, unless you got anything else to add. I'll just leave it with one last thought now. If I could have one pop quiz for everyone who joined or listens later in our recording. Next time you go approach the builders and you ask them if their AWS accounts are secured, do you have a new understanding of what that means? If so, I did my job, even at a basic level. So thank you, everyone, for joining. Chase, Ian, any plugs before we end this?
I guess I should get a t-shirt that says Dev's doing devy things now.
I'm gonna start selling those.
Get them on Amazon.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. We appreciate everyone's time and look forward to our next discussion.